He had learned, over decades, how to move through storms without losing his head. Snow was one thing, grief was another. On that Christmas Eve, the two rode together down the same road. Jackson Marconi drove a slow, deliberate lane through white fields, headlights cutting through a wind that wanted to bury the world. People in town still called him a Mafia boss, because for a long time he had been the kind of man who took care of things and made it hard to argue with him. Those days had left him with a guarded face and a private house on the outskirts where no one came unless he wanted them to. He lived with the quiet weight of what he'd lost. Daniel, who'd been the reason the lights in that house had once felt warm, and the steady, careful rituals that kept the memory from dragging him into a hollow. That night, the storm put its palm flat over the world. Jackson's tires hissed. He drove on out of habit, out of the motion that sometimes kept the grief from settling in the room with him. The highway curved. The truck in front put on hazard lights and slowed. He almost didn't look. He almost kept going, the way most people keep going when they see something in the dark. But habit had another name. There was a line inside him that always wanted to stop for the small and the broken. Something pale on the shoulder caught the headlights and turned into a human outline, thin, curled, tipped with frost. A coat too small, a cardboard hood, hands half-gloved and purple where the blood had receded from the tips of fingers. Jackson killed his lights and eased his truck onto the shoulder, boots sinking into crusted snow. The boy, too small to be just called a man in that light, lay like a discarded thing. Breath came in shallow lifts that puffed into the cold and immediately turned to glass. Finn. He would later tell Jackson the name when he could speak more than the bones of words. In the moment, Jackson saw a shape that needed to be moved. He wrapped the boy in his own coat, felt the thinness of ribs through fabric. He lifted him with the kind of practiced care that had nothing to do with threat and everything to do with steadiness. In the cab, Finn's weight was an answering sorrow, and the heat of the truck washed a little of the ice out of him. Jackson kept talking, not to coax a confession, but to fill the silence with the fact of being there. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked, low, practical. "Finn," the boy said, voice breaking like brittle ice. He blinked snow out of his lashes. His teeth chattered inside a mouth that smelled of cold. "I waited, I thought." His sentence ran away from him. Jackson didn't ask why he hadn't left sooner. There are some questions grief doesn't need to hear. Instead, he peeled off layers, wrapped Finn in a thermal blanket he kept under the passenger seat for emergencies, and started the truck again. They drove through a world reduced to white, the kind of white that makes the ordinary look like a confession. Finn's hands were trembling, hidden in the blanket, a thin body that had learned how to go small so it wouldn't be seen. Jackson watched him in the rear view, the flush of youth returning as the regimented warmth of the truck fought the cold, and felt an old reflex twist through him. Protect, shelter, keep what you can from the world. By the time they reached Jackson's gate, Finn had gotten words out in fits. "My dad left me. He said I made a mistake. He drove off," and the boy's breath came fast and wet now, like he'd been running through snow. "He said not to come home. Jackson felt the familiar hard line in his chest at the injustice of it. Some men used their voices to push people around. Others used absence the same way. To leave a child out in the night for loving like he did, it was another form of violence. Jackson could have called the authorities right away, but the phone signal in that part of the county was the kind that vanished in cold weather, and the nearest shelter was full that night. He knew it, not because of any underworld ledger, but because people in the area treated hard weather as a communal problem, and the shelters took the overflow to the main town. The town stretched on, but the roads were being marked closed. He made a choice that was small and enormous at the same time. He brought Finn inside. The house was a quiet museum of a life interrupted. Jackets hung where Daniel had once hung his coat. A pair of boots sat at the door, still dry from being polished the week Daniel had gone to the city for work and not come back. The wood stove hummed, a stubbornly ordinary beat, and the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee grounds and old soap. The house had been stopped in a moment, like a clock that suddenly signaled the rest of the day no longer mattered. Jackson had learned to live in the paused place, rotating through rituals that honored Daniel without pretending the hollow wasn't there. Finn sat on a well-worn couch and let the heat unstick him. Jackson made broth, thick with carrots and potatoes and barley, the kind of stew that holds small salvations in its depths. He peeled off Finn's boots with gentle hands and slid socks onto shaky feet. The boy's eyes kept flitting to a closed door at the back of the house, a studio that had been Jackson and Daniel's, a place of painted canvases and old music. The door was shut, not locked. He'd closed it the week after Daniel died, and left it so in case he needed to close out the sound of being two. Jackson watched Finn's fingers hover on the door as if it were a lit flame. "This place," Finn said, voice small. "It smells like—" He didn't finish. He'd seen the photograph on the mantel earlier, a photograph of two men at a fair, arms slung around each other, smiling the type of smile youth gives to the world before it insists everything is earned. Jackson had not meant to bring Finn into the studio. He had not meant to open it at all. But Finn's gaze held on the door in a way that reached into the part of him where Daniel's laugh still lived. He walked to it, put his hand on the knob, and felt something close to treason, to the habit of living alone, to the safety of being only himself. "Do you want to see?" he asked. Finn noted, like someone answering a question about whether the sky is blue. The studio smelled like turpentine and old wood and the ghost of a man's cologne. Canvases leaned against the wall, some finished in thick, bruised paint. Others were nothing but an underpainting and a suggestion. There was a mug with dried paint on the rim. The radio shelf held a cassette player that hadn't seen cassettes in years. Jackson lingered by a painting that was half complete, a landscape with a single house and two small figures in the doorway. He remembered the way Daniel had argued over the color of the grass, and how once Daniel had insisted that a crooked line could make a piece honest. Finn walked in slowly, as if the light in the room might break like glass. He ran his fingers over the edge of a canvas and smiled, a small, private thing. "I used to paint," he said. "Not much, never had a studio." There are moments in a life after loss when the decision to let someone in feels like betrayal of the person who is gone. And there are moments when the same decision feels like honoring them by letting the house breathe. Jackson stood between those two truths and chose the latter. He made space not to replace what he'd lost, but to allow a new presence to arrive. "You're welcome to stay tonight," he told Finn. It wasn't grand, it was a fact. If this story is reaching you in a way that tugs at your heart, please consider donating or supporting local LGBTQ+ youth shelters. There are links in the description where help is needed. The next morning, the town woke to a new headline of sorts that didn't make it into paper, but was spoken over fences and in the low hum of the diner. Someone had been left on the highway. News travels in small towns the way light leaks through cracks, slow but certain. Sheriff Miller came in the daylight, not with accusations, but with questions. He had known Jackson for years. Once he had been one thing and Jackson another, and both had settled into this strange arrangement of mutual respect. Sheriff Miller was careful in the way of men who had to read the law and the heart. "We can take him in," the sheriff said. "There are procedures." Finn, pale but warming with rest, looked at the sheriff and then at Jackson. "My dad left me," he said I was wrong for liking boys. His voice tightened. "He told me to wait there. He said he'd come back, and he drove off." Jackson's jaw tightened. Robert Holloway, a name, a man who had read the world the way a person shrugs, indifferent because to care asked for work. Whether Holloway's act was driven by fear, anger, or something else mattered little to Finn, who had been left. The law would do its work as the sheriff saw fit. Jackson insisted only on what Finn asked. "Not tonight. Not if you can help it." Finn needed a phone call made, a lawyer contacted, forms started. Jackson made sure to call, not to be some man who used quiet muscle to cut corners, but to be a man who had the resources to pay for counsel and the inclination to employ it lawfully. They spoke to a public defender first, then a family attorney Jackson arranged who specialized in child welfare cases and in matters of abandonment. He paid for that help the same way he'd pay for anything that needed to be done right, with efficiency and a stubborn refusal to let bureaucracy get in the way of a child's safety. No one promised a neat outcome. The legal process is a complicated machine. It asks questions and then waits for answers. Sheriff Miller told Finn he would pursue charges if the evidence supported them. Finn's father was located the following day after Jackson had placed a single anonymous call to a number he had, without saying how he had it, and given the sheriff a lead. Robert Holloway was brought in on suspicion of endangerment. The law would decide where Finn would be for the short term. Finn's voice was steady through it all. He wanted to decide where he stayed. He wanted to have a say. "Do you want to go into protective custody?" Sheriff Miller asked, deferential but direct. Finn's eyes, newly blue with warmth and tears, flicked to Jackson. He shook his head slowly. "No, I want to stay here for now, if that's okay." Jackson could have refused. He could have said it was too risky, too complicated. Instead, he signed on as a temporary adult supervisor for Finn with the proper paperwork, and he made an appointment with a counselor who worked with young people who had been through trauma and abandonment. It was the right call for the kind of man he'd become, a man who had once marshaled resources and now chose to marshal them for repair. At first, they moved through days that were small and precise. Finn learned where the wood for the stove was stacked, how to make coffee in a French press. Jackson taught him how to shave without nicking skin that had not yet learned the ways of grown-up care. Finn, in return, taught Jackson the names of colors he had never bothered with since Daniel died. He called one shade Midnight Laugh and another Ash of Hope. Jackson said nothing, but he kept a list in his head of things that mattered: the softness of Finn's laughter when he found a song he liked, the patient tilt of Finn's head when he studied an old photograph on the mantel and whispered, "Tell me about him."
They were people making a new architecture of life from small bricks, a cup of tea, a folded shirt, a plant on the sill. Finn worked in the studio each morning, paint on his fingers and a frown that relaxed into concentration. Jackson walked through the house the way someone walks through another's prayer, careful not to disturb what was being rebuilt. The town had opinions. Some folks murmured that Jackson had a soft heart, or a soft spot, or worse, that he had a weakness. Others who had known his kindness and quieter ways said nothing at all. The important things went on behind walls. Finn began therapy. He filled the forms that said who he trusted, where he'd slept, the names of friends. The attorney Jackson had arranged moved with a careful, lawful hand through the filing of temporary guardianship so that Finn's immediate needs could be met while the investigation unfolded. The process felt both thorough and cold. There were forms that asked for a child's preferences, as if a single sheet could contain the shape of pain. Finn, meanwhile, started to bloom. He enrolled in a neighborhood art class in the town center after Jackson insisted he wanted Finn to have contact with people his age. The class was modest but alive with students who traded colors like coins. Finn learned to stand back and watch, then to make a mark that pleased him. He taped a small painting to the refrigerator at Jackson's, a rough, brave landscape in which two small figures walked toward a cottage painted in hopeful yellow. At night, nightmares came. Sometimes Finn woke in a sweat and would flinch at the sound of a truck passing in the lane. Jackson would sit on the bed's edge, a quiet presence, and let Finn talk or not talk. There was consent in every single exchange between them. Finn decided when he would tell his story in full. No one pushed. That day might be weeks away, or months. Healing is a patient animal. Months passed with the ordinary, gentle addition of days. Jackson learned to let the house have noise again. The radio lived on the kitchen counter more than the mantel. Finn left old socks on the floor, and Jackson learned to look at the intrusion as proof of life, not disrespect. They shared rituals: Sunday stew, Friday record nights, a small private thing in which they read aloud to each other from books Daniel had loved. The house kept Daniel in memory, but not as a locked photograph. Instead, his memory knitted into the contours of the present. Communication with Finn's father occurred in the sterile way law requires. Holloway showed up in courtrooms with a small face that seemed to shrink under the weight of what he'd done. There were hearings, statements, and a kind of public reckoning that doesn't fix things, but at least names them. Robert Holloway said, in a voice jarred by shame and anger, that he had been afraid and had done the worst thing he could imagine. The public defender for Finn's household asked for time to assess arrangements and for what the law would define as the child's best interest. The court's decisions were not swerved by Jackson's reputation. The law had no interest in myths. It wanted facts, witnesses, documents. Evidence of abandonment was not romantic. It was a list of failures and a line in a police report. Holloway faced charges for endangerment, and the process began toward what the legal system might do. No one offered promises. The outcome was uncertain, weighted by precedent and by the smallness of the facts and the stubbornness of the law to be slow. In the studio, Finn's hand grew surer. He painted a portrait of the house, the crooked roof, the lit kitchen window, and on the doorstep 2 figures stood. The portrait was not a perfect likeness. Expectation would have called it a copy. What Finn created was a translation of belonging. Jackson stood in front of it one afternoon and felt an old, deep part of him unclench. The more immediate hurdles required practical answers. Jackson helped Finn get an ID card replaced. They met with a counselor who specialized in family estrangement and with a caseworker who explained options: foster placement,
chosen guardian petitions, or reunification efforts if it were safe. Finn had grown to trust Jackson, and his choice was to remain in the house while legal proceedings completed. He filled out forms with a cautious hand and wrote his wishes in a tiny, plain handwriting that declared his voice in a way the law would hear. Community response to the story was quieter than Jackson expected. Neighbors left casseroles and pie tins. A woman from church texted a link to a grant program that provided art supplies for underserved youth. Someone anonymously bought a new set of brushes for Finn. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a steady, community-sized kindness that didn't ask for headlines. As weeks soldered into months, the house warmed in a way that wasn't only thermal. Finn's laugh began to expand. He started inviting people from class to the house on Saturdays for soup and music. He repainted one of the walls in the kitchen bright green because he said it made the light in the morning feel like money in the world. Jackson pretended not to notice the small domestic takeover, then realized that pretending wasn't necessary anymore. He liked the noise. The more Finn repaired, the more Jackson's own chest sutured. He found himself talking about Daniel in the evenings, telling small stories that had once been private. He would reveal an argument they had, or the way Daniel had loved a particular song, and Finn listened with the attentiveness of someone who knew grief by proximity. When he shared a memory, it didn't feel like betrayal of the dead. It was a way to keep Daniel's presence whole, by acknowledging he was part of the house's architecture. There was a single, quiet turning point, both small and large. After a night of wind that rattled all of the windows, Finn woke and dragged a blanket over his shoulders, sat in the studio, and painted Jackson's hands while he was working on the stove. The painting, a study of worn knuckles, a ring Jason never took off, caught more truth than 1,000 words. The hands were not pretty, they were honest. Finn left the canvas propped where Jackson would see it the next morning, a gift rendered without fanfare. Jackson looked at the painting and felt his trust do something his grief had forbidden for years. It softened, not enough to collapse, but enough to make room for something new. He understood he had been given a choice, to hold his house as a shrine that meant nothing but absence, or to let it be a place where more lives could be tended. He chose the latter. There were tense moments. The town's gossip coalesced into questions. People asked, sometimes politely, and sometimes with veiled curiosity, what exactly Jackson's role was in Finn's life. Jackson answered with the same economy he'd used his entire life, with facts and with a steady presence. He was a guardian for now, he said. They were sorting the rest through the legal system. That was all. He refused to let his past as a man with a reputation be the focus of Finn's present. Finn's father abided in a separate legal orbit now. There were mandated counseling sessions ordered by the court and a probationary schedule that Holloway found humiliating. Holloway wrote letters to Finn at first, awkward, insincere, then did not understand why the letters sat unread on Jackson's counter. Sentences in those letters tried to thin the wrongness of what he'd done. They tried to paint fear as explanation. Finn read them once and then asked Jackson to keep the mail sorted with the rest of the household. He did not want to be bait for a father who might approach again and do more damage. Finn's art began to garner attention. A small local exhibition featured his work in a modest gallery downtown, and people responded to the freshness of an artist who painted belonging the way birds build nests. Jackson sat in the corner at the opening, like a man in plain clothes who knew how to stay out of the limelight when it mattered. Finn beamed, not from exhibitionism, but from the excitement of being seen for his work. He had fans that were local and unassuming, a retired teacher who requested prints, children from the art class who wanted to try Finn's palette knife. The house had become a place of practice and rehearsal, where small kindnesses circulated like currency. One late winter evening, the kind that left the trees like black sketches on a white page, Finn brought Jackson a wrapped canvas. He'd been working on it in secret, paint smudges on the cuffs of his sweater, and a look of concentration Jackson had come to know as quiet courage. When Jackson untied the twine and revealed the painting, his breath stopped. It was him. Not in the superhero sense, not towering or exaggerated. It was a portrait of a man at a small table making coffee, light spilling across the table, a radio on the shelf, and a pair of boots by the door. In the doorway, a small figure, a suggestion, waited. The painting didn't try to name it as romance or ownership. It simply held a moment in which two people inhabited the same small domestic world. Jackson felt many things at once: gratitude, a strange clawing fear that if he acknowledged the gift he might be mistaken in the nature of what it meant, and a slowly warming hope that the house could hold love again without erasing memory. Finn watched him, hands twisted in the cloth of his sleeves. "You didn't have to," Jackson began. "I wanted to," Finn said.
It felt like home. I painted it because I wanted you to see what you look like when you're quiet. You look safe. Safe. The word landed differently in Jackson's chest than it had in any courtroom or bargain or threat. It was a promise without armor. He put his hand on Finn's shoulder, an adult touch that asked permission. Finn leaned in. Consent again, simple and true. Time, as it does, kept moving. The legal motion that meant the world to Finn, a more permanent guardianship petition, came with hearings that lasted all day. Jackson signed forms and went through testimony that described a child's abandonment, a father's negligence, and a community's desire to see the child best cared for. The judge listened. The judge asked questions. Holloway insisted he loved his son and had made a terrible mistake. Finn sat in court with a small calm, his hand on the painting that Jackson had hung in his study. No guarantee came. The judge made a ruling that acknowledged the father's rights, but also set strict terms and a longer review period that could, if the law found it appropriate, allow for longer guardianship. They had to wait and then check in and recheck. It was messy and human and imperfect. Finn understood the legal ambiguity fully. He had learned that adult systems were not salvific systems. He had also learned that laws could protect him when used well. Jackson's role was to be steady while the law did its thing. They continued their rituals. On the anniversary of Daniel's death, Jackson did a small thing. He took the old records Daniel loved and placed them on the shelf again. Finn and Jackson listened to a song Daniel had sung badly but loved, and they let themselves talk about him without reverence or avoidance. They spoke of love as something that could be more than a single person. It could be a chain of care. The household began a small outreach inspired by Finn's rescue. Jackson placed a wooden box at the roadside near his gate, weatherproof and hung with a hand-painted sign, "Leave warmth." He didn't put instructions or a manifesto. He put out gloves and hats, snacks, and a plastic-wrapped list of numbers for local crisis lines and shelters.
Someone asked him why he was doing it. He shrugged. "Someone left a child on the road," he said. "I don't like that kind of thing to happen twice." People began to leave donations anonymously. A church group organized a drive for thermal blankets. A small bakery sent bread to the house each week for whoever needed hot food coming into the lane. It wasn't a grand program with press releases and grants. It was a human response, neighbors doing neighborly things, because the image of a boy sleeping in the snow had lodged in them like a stone. By the time spring made tentative gestures, Finn had applied for an art grant aimed at new artists. He won a small stipend to buy canvases and supplies. Jackson wrote a short support letter, not as a Mafia boss with influence, but as a guardian who could testify to Finn's integrity and talent. The letter carried with it what mattered, an adult who would vouch that Finn had a place to come back to, where someone would be there. Their relationship evolved. Never rushed, always anchored in consent and shared choice. They grew protective of each other's autonomy. Finn took solo trips to town with his art class, sometimes staying overnight at friends' houses. Jackson gave them both the space to miss without panic. They built new traditions with small devotion. Every Christmas Eve now, they made a pot of stew and left an extra bowl on the table. They called it the open bowl, and anyone who needed sat down and ate with them. There was no cinematic conversion of Holloway, no grand reconciliation staged for television. The father, when he tried to reconnect, did so through a court procedure and then through a supervised visit that left Finn unsettled. Finn decided, slowly and with counsel, what contact he would allow. He had agency in the decision. He was not forced into forgiveness. If forgiveness came, it would come as a real act, not an obligation. Community advocacy grew at a gentle pace. The small shelter in town began partnering with local artists to create programs for teens who had aged out of support systems or who had been pushed out of their homes. Finn volunteered to run a workshop once a month, teaching others to let color be a vocabulary for feelings they couldn't speak aloud. He found that teaching gave him a particular kind of healing, helping someone else name the shape of their shelter's hope. Jackson, who had once measured the world by different metrics, found new meaning in domestic competence, signing forms, sitting through meetings, baking a loaf of bread, and learning to repair a leaky faucet. He kept certain boundaries. He didn't turn the house into a salon where his past was the topic of conversation. He didn't use his connections as a shortcut. He used them when it mattered for good, to bring Finn to a doctor, to pay a therapist, to ensure the legal process had representation. He insisted on lawful ways, because he'd learned that quick, secretive solutions cost too much. One summer, the town organized a small festival to support arts education and donated to the shelter where Finn had once been promised a bed. Finn and Jackson walked through the tents, painting by painting, and Jackson realized he liked being known now, not as a man who used shadows, but as one who could be counted on to give. It was not a redemption story with trumpets. It was a quiet, stubborn reorientation of how to be generous in a world that often mistook toughness for virtue. Late one evening, after a day of painting classes and a late dinner, Jackson and Finn sat on the porch with mugs of something sweet and hot. Finn took out a small, weathered envelope. Inside was a letter from a stranger, someone who'd seen the roadside box and had been moved. They had left money for Finn's supplies and a note, for the boy left out in the snow. Finn read it aloud. His voice trembled with gratitude and shame that someone had been kind for no reason other than to be kind. Jackson set his mug down and looked out at the lane, where months ago hazard lights had marked the place of rescue. He thought of Daniel and of the small, catastrophic way grief reshapes a life. He thought of Finn's hand painting his old knuckles, translating his care. He thought of the ways people can be harder on themselves than anyone deserves. He reached for Finn's hand without fanfare. Finn laced their fingers, a small, utterly human clasp that made no vows and asked for none. One morning, with a bright, clean light that made the garden look newly invented, Finn finished a portrait, not a study, but a public canvas. He invited a few people from town to see it: the gallery owner who'd shown his first pieces, the counselor who'd helped him, Sheriff Miller, and a neighbor who'd baked him pies when the house was just a rumor of warmth. Jackson stood beside him as Finn unveiled the painting. It was the house itself, but in the doorway were two figures, one older, steady, one smaller and curious, and behind them a wash of light. The painting didn't say how they were named or what the future would hold. It simply depicted the truth that in that room there was an honest shelter and two people who belonged there. People murmured. Jackson felt a hush that was not public decoration, but a private recognition. They had built a life together, small and durable. Later, alone in the kitchen, Finn asked the question that had no hurry but needed an answer. What happens now? Jackson could have said nothing, saying instead that time would tell. Instead, he reached for the portrait of Daniel that still hung in the study and touched the frame. Now, he said, we keep doing the things that matter. We keep the house open, the stew warm, the studio used. We keep the laws working for you and the outreach going for anyone who needs the box by the road. We keep seeing each other. There was a pause that wasn't heavy. It was full of agreements made without the need for sealing. Finn leaned his head on Jackson's shoulder, not to hide, but to rest. No stars announced it, no moment required vows. They had created a found family, measured in dishes washed and canvases stretched, and in the slow tether of being there. Months later, after the legal review period had passed and a judge had set a plan for longer-term guardianship that required check-ins and periodic reviews, rather than a finality that neither law nor life could promise at that moment, Finn's father was sentenced to a supervised program and mandated counseling. It wasn't absolution. It was consequence, and potentially reform. The judge made clear the process was ongoing, and the family's reunification would be decided only if it proved safe. Finn had agency at every step. That mattered more than tidy resolutions. Their outreach project turned into something the town relied on in small ways. The roadside Leave Warmth box built into a weatherproof cabinet became a fixture. People left donated snacks, wool socks, bus passes, and notes. One winter brought a bad storm, and the box had a line of small notes thanking anonymous hands. It didn't change the world, but it fed someone that night and kept the lane from becoming a place where people could vanish. Years later, Finn and Jackson still lived in the house. Not in triumph, not in myth, just two people who had learned to care for each other. The studio held canvases that became part of small collections and a larger local show. Finn had students who called him by their first name and came on Saturdays to learn how to turn a feeling into a color. Jackson had friends who came for dinner and sat in comfortable silence. They kept Daniel's record shelf, played his songs, and argued, sometimes gently, about whether the grass in a painting should be green or the cautious, softer shade Daniel had always insisted on. On a cold Christmas Eve some years after the roadside rescue, they hung an extra stocking by the hearth. It was a small, symbolic act they had never let themselves have before. There were 3 stockings now, one small, one medium, and one that had been there since before anyone could name grief. Finn had painted the small one with a little bright star. Jackson nodded to it, feeling the strange arc of a life that had bent toward tenderness. They went to bed early that night, with the radio playing quiet songs. In the morning, they found the yard had been shoveled clear as always, and beside the gate was a small envelope for Jackson. Inside was a note from someone who had used the roadside box months before and had been helped by the warmth found there. "You don't know us," it read, "but you stopped someone from freezing. Thank you on behalf of those of us who have been homeless. Keep the boxes full." Jackson folded the note and kept it in his wallet. He could not promise to fix every wrong. He could not promise every child would have a home. He could promise, however, to keep his house open to the ones who needed it like a harbor. That night, Finn finished a painting. It was the sort of painting that only happens when someone's life has been tended with attention, not flashy, but honest. He showed Jackson the canvas without ceremony. It was a portrait of 2 small figures in the doorway of a crooked house, light pooling at their feet. On the mantel inside were a pair of records and a mug with paint smudges. The painting wasn't labeled "Happily Ever After." It was an offering of continued care. They hung the portrait in the foyer, where anyone who came in could see it. It became for visitors what it had been for them, a reminder that a house can be a place where people arrive broken and leave standing straighter. If you can, consider supporting youth shelters or local organizations that protect LGBTQ+ young people from abandonment. Your help makes practical rescue possible. And if this story touched you, subscribe and share to help more people hear about small acts that keep someone from freezing on the roadside. The world, Jackson had learned, is not cured by single gestures. It is reshaped by them, by the steady, honest work of being present, by the mundane arts of boiling soup and teaching someone to tie their laces, by using lawful means to protect a child, and by painting a portrait that holds the shape of a life worth keeping. In a house that once had been a tomb of silence, there was now the sound of paint being mixed, a kettle singing, and 2 people who had chosen one another not as a replacement for what they'd lost, but as an addition to it. On a cold, clear morning, Jackson stood at the gate and watched a pair of teenagers walk up the lane carrying a box labeled warm clothes. Finn followed behind, paint on his palms and a grin that made the morning feel new. Jackson's hand found Finn's shoulder in a casual, sure way. They didn't need to announce their safety. It had been painted into the life around them. The portrait on the foyer wall watched them like a promise kept. The house hummed with ordinary needs being met and the careful, relentless kindness of people who have learned to stop.